The winter of 1847 was merciless across the western frontier. Temperatures plummeted to record lows, and snowstorms raged for days without pause. It was during one such blizzard that Elizabeth Morgan found herself abandoned with her 6-month-old. Twins in a broken-down wagon, miles from the nearest settlement. The wagon train she had joined after her husband's death had moved on without her when one of the wagon wheels shattered on the frozen ground. As the howling winds intensified and supplies dwindled, Elizabeth knew they wouldn't survive another night without help. What she couldn't know was that salvation would come from the most unexpected source, a lone Comanche hunter named Swift Arrow, whose people were considered enemies by the very settlers who had left her to die. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elizabeth Morgan clutched her twins closer to her chest as another gust of wind rattled the canvas covering of her wagon. The temperature had dropped dramatically since nightfall, and the thin blanket she had wrapped around James and Sarah barely kept the biting cold at bay. Outside, the endless expanse of the Texas prairie had transformed into a white wasteland, with snow piling higher by the hour. 3 days ago, Elizabeth had been traveling with the Wilson wagon train, a group of 12 families heading west toward the promise of cheap land and new beginnings. She had joined them in St. Louis after burying her husband Thomas, who had succumbed to typhoid just weeks before their planned departure. With 2 infants and no family left back east, Elizabeth had sold everything they owned to secure passage. With the Wilson train, hoping to reach the settlement where Thomas's brother had established a small ranch. The journey had been arduous from the start. November was a dangerous time to cross the open plains, but the wagon master, Jeremiah Wilson, had insisted they could outrun winter if they maintained a grueling pace. Elizabeth's wagon had struggled to keep up, her horses weaker than the others, and her skills as a driver still developing. When the front wheel of her wagon shattered on a hidden rock beneath the snow, the other families had stopped briefly. Jeremiah assessed the damage and delivered his verdict without emotion. The wheel couldn't be fixed without materials they didn't have, and they couldn't spare a wagon or horses for a widow and her children without endangering the entire group. "We'll send help back from the Richardson settlement," Jeremiah had promised, not quite meeting her eyes. "Should be a 3 days ride from here if the weather holds." Elizabeth had watched in disbelief as the wagon train disappeared into the swirling snow, leaving her with limited supplies, a broken wagon, and 2 hungry infants who didn't understand why their world had suddenly become so cold and quiet. That had been 2 days ago. No help had arrived. The first night, Elizabeth had maintained hope. She had created a small fire from the wood stored in her wagon and rationed the food carefully. The horses had been tethered close to the wagon, providing some additional warmth, but by morning one horse had broken free, disappearing into the white void beyond. The second horse had died during the night, its thin body now buried under a growing mound of snow. By the second night, the firewood had run out. Elizabeth had burned everything she could spare, a wooden chest that had been a wedding gift, the handle of her broom, even the wooden frame of her husband's portrait. The food was nearly gone as well. She'd stopped eating entirely, saving every morsel for her milk supply, which was dwindling dangerously as her own body weakened. Now, as the third night approached and the storm intensified rather than abated, Elizabeth faced the terrible reality that help would not arrive in time. The Richardson settlement might not even exist anymore if the storm had been as brutal there as it was here. The promise of sending help had likely been empty words meant to ease Jeremiah's conscience as he abandoned a woman and 2 babies to the merciless prairie winter. "Hush now, my darlings," Elizabeth whispered as Sarah began to whimper. The baby's face was pale, her lips taking on a bluish tinge that terrified Elizabeth. James had stopped crying hours ago, his tiny body conserving what little energy remained. "Mama's here. Mama won't leave you." Elizabeth tucked the babies into the small wooden crate that had served as their cradle throughout the journey. She had lined it with every scrap of fabric she owned, her spare dress, Thomas's shirts, even the curtains that had been meant for their new home. The makeshift nest provided better insulation than her weakening arms could offer. With the babies secured, Elizabeth forced her stiff legs to move. She needed to search the wagon one last time for anything that might burn. As she rummaged through the few remaining possessions, her fingers closed around Thomas's Bible. She hesitated only briefly before setting it aside. Not yet. Not unless there was absolutely nothing else. The storm outside howled with renewed fury, driving snow through the smallest gaps in the canvas covering. Elizabeth used the last of her sewing kit to patch the worst holes. Her fingers so numb she pricked herself repeatedly without feeling the pain. Time was running out. Without heat they wouldn't survive until morning. As darkness fell, Elizabeth made a desperate decision. She would harness herself to the broken wagon and try to drag it toward where she believed the trail continued. It was madness. A woman weakened by hunger and cold could never pull a wagon through snowdrifts, but staying meant certain death. Movement, no matter how futile, at least offered the illusion of hope. Elizabeth prepared as best she could, wrapping the twins in every available layer and securing them in their crate. She fashioned a crude harness from leather straps and positioned herself between the wagon shafts where the horse had once stood. With a deep breath that crystallized in the frigid air, she leaned forward and pulled. The wagon didn't move. She pulled harder, muscles screaming, feet slipping in the snow. After several attempts that left her gasping and dizzy, Elizabeth collapsed against the wagon wheel. The bitter reality crushed down upon her like the relentless snow. They were trapped, and they were going to die here. As night fully descended, Elizabeth crawled back into the wagon and gathered her children into her arms. If these were to be their final hours, they would face them together. She began to sing softly, a lullaby her own mother had sung to her, her voice barely audible above the wind. The twins, too weak to cry, nestled against her. Elizabeth didn't notice when she stopped shivering, a dangerous sign her body was surrendering to the cold. Her thoughts became sluggish, drifting to memories of warmer days. She thought of Thomas and the small farm they had planned to build. She imagined her children growing up, running through fields of wildflowers instead of lying pale and still in her failing arms. It was in this half-conscious state that Elizabeth first heard the sound, a rhythmic crunching of snow that her mind slowly recognized as footsteps. She struggled to rouse herself, wondering if she was hallucinating, but the sound continued, growing closer. "Hello?" she called, her voice cracking from disuse and cold. "Is someone there?" The canvas flap of the wagon moved, and snow swirled in, along with a blast of frigid air. Elizabeth clutched her babies tighter, squinting into the darkness. A figure stood silhouetted against the night sky, tall and broad-shouldered, wrapped in what appeared to be animal furs. For a moment, Elizabeth felt a surge of hope. Jeremiah had sent help after all. But as her eyes adjusted, she realized this was not one of the men from the wagon train. The stranger wore his black hair in long braids adorned with beads and feathers. His face, partially illuminated by what little light remained, bore markings that identified him as one of the indigenous peoples of the plains, the very people the settlers had been warned to fear. The man's dark eyes took in the scene quickly. The dying mother, the silent infants, the evidence of a desperate last stand against the elements. Without a word, he moved into the wagon, crouching to examine the twins. Elizabeth was too weak to protest or flee. Besides, what worse fate could befall them than the one already claiming them inch by frozen inch? The stranger touched each baby's He faced gently, then placed a hand on Elizabeth's forehead. He spoke, but in a language she didn't understand. His voice was deep and surprisingly gentle. He repeated himself, then switched to broken English. "You die soon. Children too." It wasn't a threat, but a simple statement of fact. "My camp is near, come." Elizabeth struggled to comprehend his words through her cold-induced mental fog. This man was offering to save them? She had heard stories of the Comanche, none of them suggesting mercy toward white settlers. As if reading her thoughts, the man spoke again. "Choose, die here or chance with me." Put that way, there was no choice at all. Elizabeth nodded weakly. With efficient movements, the stranger gathered the twins, securing them inside his fur coat against his chest. Then he helped Elizabeth to her feet, though her legs immediately buckled. Without hesitation, he swept her up with his free arm and carried her out into the storm. The cold hit Elizabeth like a physical blow, stealing what little breath remained in her lungs. She closed her eyes against the stinging snow, certain she would open them to find herself at heaven's gates. But instead, she felt movement, steady, purposeful strides carrying them through the blizzard. She drifted in and out of consciousness as they traveled. At times, she was aware of the man's heartbeat, strong and steady against her ear, where her head rested against his chest. At other times, she heard nothing but the wind. The twins made no sound at all, and she prayed they still lived. Elizabeth had no concept of how far they had traveled when she became aware of a change. The howling wind had diminished, and there was the smell of smoke. Not the pleasant smoke of a hearth, but the earthier scent of a campfire. She forced her eyes open to see they had entered some kind of shelter, a structure made of animal hides, stretched over a wooden frame. A fire burned in the center, filling the space with blessed warmth. The stranger laid Elizabeth on a bed of furs near the flames, then carefully removed the twins from inside his coat. To her immense relief, both babies stirred, making small sounds of discomfort as circulation painfully returned to their tiny limbs. The man spoke again in his native tongue, calling out, and a woman appeared from the shadows of the shelter. She was younger than Elizabeth, perhaps 16 or 17, with the same dark eyes and hair as the man. Sister Elizabeth guessed, not wife. The woman exclaimed in alarm when she saw the newcomers, but the man spoke rapidly, and she nodded in understanding. What followed was a flurry of activity that Elizabeth observed through a haze of exhaustion. The young woman heated water and mixed it with something from a pouch at her waist. The man removed Elizabeth's frozen outer garments and wrapped her in furs that smelled of smoke and animal fat, but provided blessed warmth. The twins were undressed, rubbed with some kind of oil, and swaddled in soft rabbit skins. The young woman brought the warm liquid to Elizabeth's lips. It tasted bitter, but not unpleasant, and heat spread through her body as she drank. The man held each twin in turn, carefully feeding them drops of a different concoction from a small bladder, with a narrow opening that served as a primitive bottle. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name, Elizabeth, she managed to say when she could form words again. My babies, James and Sarah, thank you for saving us. The man nodded solemnly. I am called Swift Arrow in your tongue. This is my sister, Morning Sky. The settlers, they left us. Elizabeth didn't know why she felt compelled to explain, but Swift Arrow shook his head. Rest now. Words later, Elizabeth wanted to ask more questions. How he had found them, why he had helped them, what would happen when morning came. But exhaustion claimed her. The last thing she saw before sleep took her was the firelight reflecting in Swift Arrow's eyes as he cradled her son, singing a low, rhythmic song that somehow made her feel safer than she had in months. When Elizabeth woke, sunlight filtered through the smoke hole at the top of the shelter. The blizzard had passed. Both twins were sleeping peacefully beside her, their cheeks pink with healthy color rather than the deathly pallor of the night before. Morning Sky sat nearby, grinding something with a stone pestle, while there was no sign of Swift Arrow. Elizabeth struggled to sit up, and Morning Sky immediately moved to help her, offering another cup of the bitter drink. Through gestures and the few English words the young woman knew, Elizabeth learned that Swift Arrow had gone hunting, but would return by nightfall. As the day progressed, Elizabeth's strength began to return. She was able to feed her babies, who seemed remarkably recovered from their ordeal. Morning Sky showed her how to change the twins' swaddling and apply more of the fragrant oil to their skin. The young woman seemed fascinated by the babies, especially Sarah's red gold hair, so different from the black hair of her people. By the time Swift Arrow returned in the late afternoon, Elizabeth was able to stand and move around the shelter. The Comanche hunter entered carrying several rabbits, already cleaned and ready for cooking. He nodded to Elizabeth, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. As Morning Sky prepared the rabbits for the cooking fire, Elizabeth finally asked the question that had burned in her mind since their rescue. "Why did you help us? Your people and mine, they are not friends." Swift Arrow was silent for so long that Elizabeth thought he might not answer. When he did, his English was slow but clear. "5 winters ago, white soldiers killed my wife and son. They were innocent, gathering plants far from camp." His eyes held Elizabeth steadily. "I could have left you and your children to the same fate, but what would that make me?" He gestured to the twins. "Children are sacred gifts, no matter whose blood they carry. The Great Spirit would not honor me if I ignored their cries." Elizabeth felt tears well in her eyes. This man, who had every reason to hate her kind, had shown more humanity than the settlers who shared her heritage and faith. "What will happen to us now?" she asked quietly. Swift Arrow glanced at his sister, who was singing softly to Sarah as she worked. "When snow melts, I take you to the trading post at River Fork. White people there. They help you find your people." Elizabeth shook her head. "I have no people left. The wagon train. They will not welcome me back after abandoning me." She hesitated. "My husband's brother has a ranch near a place called Richardson's Settlement. If it exists—" "I know this place." Swift Arrow nodded. 3 days' ride when trails clear, but the snow did not melt for many days. You stay until it's safe to travel." The simple offer of shelter until spring brought fresh tears to Elizabeth's eyes. "Why would you do this for us?" Swift Arrow's expression softened slightly as he looked at the twins. "My people have a saying. Every child born is all children. Born. Your children remind me that life continues, even after great loss." He turned away, moving to help his sister with the cooking, and the conversation clearly finished. That night, as Elizabeth fed her babies by the fire, she watched Swift Arrow and Morning Sky talking quietly in their language. Despite the circumstances that had brought them together and the countless differences between them, she felt safer in this hide shelter with these strangers than she had since Thomas's death. The journey ahead would be difficult. Elizabeth had no illusions about the challenges of frontier life for a widow with infant twins, but for the first time, she allowed herself to believe they might actually survive to face those challenges. Outside, the stars emerged in a clear sky, the storm now just a memory. The world was still a frozen wilderness, but within the shelter, warmth and life persevered against all odds. Elizabeth stroked her children's heads and whispered a promise. "We will survive this, my darlings, and we will never forget the man who taught us that mercy knows no boundaries." Swift Arrow looked up, as if sensing her thoughts, and their eyes met across the fire. No words were needed as understanding passed between them. Two souls from different, Worlds connected by the simple, profound truth that compassion could bridge the deepest divides. For 2 weeks, the snow continued to fall intermittently, rendering the trails impassable. Elizabeth's days fell into a rhythm unlike anything she had known before. Each morning she woke to find Morning Sky already tending the fire, the young woman's movements graceful and efficient. They communicated through a growing vocabulary of shared words and elaborate gestures, teaching each other phrases in their respective languages. Elizabeth learned that Swift Arrow and Morning Sky were the last of their immediate family. Their parents had died from a sickness that had swept through their band 3 winters ago, and Swift Arrow had chosen to live apart from the main Comanche camps after losing his wife and child. Morning Sky had refused to leave her brother, forsaking potential marriages to remain by his side. "My brother's heart turned to stone," Morning Sky explained one afternoon as she showed Elizabeth how to scrape a rabbit hide. "But not all are gone. Stone can still be warm from the sun." Elizabeth understood the metaphor. Swift Arrow maintained a stoic demeanor, but his actions revealed a compassion his expression concealed. He spent hours fashioning tiny moccasins for the twins from the softest doeskin, decorating them with intricate beadwork that surely required more patience than the practical purpose justified. He carved small wooden toys, a horse for James, a bird for Sarah, sanding them perfectly smooth to protect tiny fingers. When not hunting or maintaining their shelter, Swift Arrow would sit silently, watching the twins as they grew stronger. Each day, sometimes, when he thought Elizabeth was sleeping, he would speak to them in his native tongue, his voice low and melodic. Elizabeth never asked what he said to them. Some things were too private, too sacred to intrude upon. By the beginning of the 3rd week, the twins had fully recovered from their ordeal. They had grown plump on a diet of Elizabeth's milk, supplemented by a nutritious broth Morning Sky prepared from various plants and dried berries she had stored for winter. James had developed a particular attachment to Swift Arrow, ceasing his, crying immediately whenever the Comanche hunter picked him up. "He knows strength," Swift Arrow commented when Elizabeth remarked on this. "Men recognize men." It was the closest thing to a jest she had heard from him, and Elizabeth found herself smiling more often as the days passed. The grief of Thomas's death remained, but it had been joined by a new emotion, gratitude for this unexpected second chance at life. The first real thaw came suddenly. One morning, Elizabeth woke to the sound of water dripping from the edges of the shelter. Swift Arrow announced it was time to prepare for the journey to Richardson's settlement. 3 days if the weather holds, he explained as he laid out supplies. Longer if snow returns. Elizabeth watched him work, a knot forming in her stomach. She had grown accustomed to the safety of this temporary home, to Morning Sky's friendship and Swift Arrow's quiet presence. The prospect of returning to the white settlements filled her with uncertainty rather than relief. "What if—" she began, then faltered. Swift Arrow looked up, waiting. "What if my husband's brother won't take us in?" It was a fear she had carried silently. Thomas had not parted on good terms with his brother William. They had quarreled over inheritance, and the last letter Thomas had received from William had been cold, perfunctory. Elizabeth had never met her brother-in-law, and now she was about to arrive on his doorstep, an unexpected widow with 2 hungry mouths to feed. Swift Arrow considered her words carefully. "Then you return with us until spring proper. Find a different settlement." The simple offer loosened the knot in Elizabeth's chest. She nodded gratefully. Morning Sky spent the day preparing provisions for their journey, pemmican made from dried buffalo meat and berries, flatbread cooked on hot stones, and a special mixture for the twins that could be reconstituted with water. Elizabeth contributed by sewing a carrier for the babies from deer hide, designed to be worn across the chest, leaving hands free for travel. That evening, as they shared a final meal in the shelter that had been their sanctuary, Elizabeth found herself fighting tears. Morning Sky noticed and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "You are sister now," she said simply. "Always welcome at our fire." Elizabeth squeezed back, unable to express how deeply those words touched her. In the span of a few weeks, these strangers had become more family to her than any blood relation she had left in the world. At dawn, they set out. Swift Arrow had fashioned a travois, a triangular frame of poles with a hide platform stretched between them that could be pulled by his horse. Elizabeth and the twins rode on the travois, while Swift Arrow led the horse on foot. Morning Sky walked alongside, occasionally reaching over to adjust the twins' blankets or offer Elizabeth water from a skin bag. The landscape was transformed by the thaw. What had been an endless expanse of white was now revealed as rolling prairie interspersed, with stands of cottonwood trees following the course of frozen streams. Swift Arrow set a steady pace, his moccasined feet finding the firmest ground with unerring accuracy. They made camp that night in a small grove that provided shelter from the wind. Swift Arrow constructed a temporary lean-to, and they huddled together for warmth. The twins, soothed by the day's steady motion, slept deeply despite the unfamiliar surroundings. "Tomorrow we cross into territory where white men hunt," Swift Arrow informed Elizabeth as they watched the fire. "Better if I am not seen." Elizabeth understood the implication. A Native American traveling with a white woman would raise questions, dangerous questions. "What should I tell people if we're discovered? About how I survived?" Swift Arrow's expression remained impassive. "Truth is a weapon sometimes. Silence is a shield other times. You decide which serves you better." She nodded, considering his wisdom. The truth that a Comanche warrior had shown more humanity than her own people might not be received well in the settlements. Yet the thought of denying Swift Arrow's role in their salvation felt like a betrayal. "I won't deny what you've done for us," she said firmly. "Whatever consequences come." Something flickered in Swift Arrow's eyes. Respect, perhaps. He nodded once and turned his attention back to the fire. The second day brought them to a small river, swollen with melting snow, but still partially frozen along the edges. Swift Arrow spent an hour searching for the safest crossing point, finally selecting a shallow ford where the current ran less fiercely. Leading the horse carefully, he guided them into the frigid water. The horse balked midway, sensing the power of the current. Morning Sky immediately waded in to help, the water reaching her waist. Together, she and her brother urged the frightened animal forward, while Elizabeth clutched the twins tightly, ready to lift them high if the travois dipped too low. They had nearly reached the opposite bank when Morning Sky lost her footing on the slippery riverbed. The current swept her downstream instantly, her startled cry cut short as she went under. Without hesitation, Swift Arrow released the horse and dove after his sister, powerful strokes carrying him through the churning water. Elizabeth watched in horror as both disappeared around a bend. The horse, sensing its freedom, scrambled up the riverbank, dragging the travois, with Elizabeth and the twins still aboard, roughly onto land. The jarring motion sent the babies into frightened wails, but Elizabeth barely registered their cries. Her eyes remained fixed on the river, searching desperately for any sign of her rescuers. Long minutes passed with no sign of either Comanche. Elizabeth's mind raced. If they didn't return, what would she do? She had no idea how far they were from Richardson's settlement, no weapons to hunt with, no knowledge of how to survive alone in this wilderness, just as panic threatened to overwhelm. Her Swift Arrow appeared around the bend, Morning Sky limp in his arms. He staggered up the bank, laying his sister gently on the ground. Morning Sky's lips were blue, her skin ashen, but her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. Elizabeth rushed to help, remembering what her grandmother had taught her about cold water drowning. "We need to get her warm," she instructed already, unwrapping Sarah to free a blanket and get the water from her lungs. Swift Arrow nodded grimly. He turned Morning Sky onto her side, pressing firmly between her shoulder blades. Water trickled from her mouth and she coughed weakly. Elizabeth draped the blanket over her, then added her own shawl. "Make fire," Swift Arrow ordered, his voice tight with worry. "Quick!" Elizabeth had never started a fire alone before, but necessity proved a harsh teacher. Using the flint and striker from Swift Arrow's pouch, she managed to ignite a small pile of tinder, carefully feeding it until flames appeared. Swift Arrow, meanwhile, stripped off Morning Sky's wet garments and wrapped her in the driest hides they possessed. For hours, they worked together to save the young woman's life. Swift Arrow heated stones in the fire, wrapping them in cloth to place around his sister's body. Elizabeth prepared a tea from herbs Morning Sky had packed, coaxing the semi-conscious girl to sip small amounts. The twins, sensing the gravity of the situation, remained unusually quiet in their makeshift cradle of saddlebags. By nightfall, Morning Sky's condition had improved enough that her brother allowed himself a moment's rest. He sat heavily beside the fire, exhaustion etched in every line of his face. For the first time since Elizabeth had met him, Swift Arrow looked vulnerable. "She is all I have left," he said softly, eyes fixed on his sister's sleeping form. "I know," Elizabeth replied, thinking of her own children. "And you risked her to save us." Swift Arrow shook his head. Was her choice to come, always her choice. He looked directly at Elizabeth. She said, "Your babies remind her of hope, worth the risk." A lump formed in Elizabeth's throat. "Rest now," she urged. "I'll watch over her." To her surprise, Swift Arrow nodded and stretched out near the fire. Within minutes, his breathing deepened into sleep. Elizabeth settled herself between Morning Sky and the twins, prepared for a long night of vigilance. Morning brought improvement. Morning Sky awoke with a fever, but was lucid enough to take broth and speak a few words. The river crossing had cost them precious time, however, and Swift Arrow announced they would need to journey for 2 more days rather than 1 to reach their destination. "You should continue without me," Morning Sky insisted when she learned of the delay. "Leave me with supplies. Return after taking them to the settlement." Both Swift Arrow and Elizabeth immediately rejected this suggestion. "We continue together. When you're stronger," her brother said with finality. They remained at the riverside camp for 2 additional days, while Morning Sky recovered enough to travel. During this time, Swift Arrow taught Elizabeth basic survival skills: how to identify animal tracks, which plants were safe to eat, how to navigate by sun and stars. Elizabeth absorbed every lesson eagerly, aware that such knowledge might mean the difference between life and death on the frontier. On the morning of the 5th day since leaving their winter shelter, they resumed their journey. Morning Sky was well enough to ride the horse, with Swift Arrow now pulling the travois, carrying Elizabeth and the twins. The delay meant their food supplies were running dangerously low, but Swift Arrow managed to snare 2 rabbits that evening, providing a much-needed fresh meal. The following day, they caught sight of smoke rising in the distance. Chimney smoke, Swift Arrow confirmed, from permanent structures. They had reached the outskirts of Richardson settlement. Swift Arrow halted their progress in a small copse of trees. "I go no further," he stated. "Not safe for me near White Settlement." Elizabeth had expected this, but still felt a pang of sorrow. "How will I find you again if things don't go well with William?" "Follow Creek north for 2 days," Swift Arrow instructed, pointing to a small stream nearby. "We camp there until the full moon. If you do not come by then, we move to summer hunting grounds." Morning Sky dismounted carefully, still weak from her ordeal. She embraced Elizabeth with surprising strength. "You are a strong woman," she said. "Stronger than you know." Elizabeth returned the embrace, then watched as Morning Sky did the same, with each twin whispering something in her native tongue that sounded like a blessing. When she stepped back, her eyes shone with unshed tears. Swift Arrow approached last. He stood before Elizabeth, his expression once again the impassive mask she had first encountered in the blizzard. But his eyes held warmth that belied his stoic demeanor. "The Great Spirit guided me to you in the snow," he said. "Perhaps it was to teach us both that enemies can become family when hearts are open." Elizabeth reached for his hand, gripping it firmly. "You will never be my enemy, Swift Arrow. My children and I owe you our lives, and that can never be repaid." His mouth quirked in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Not debt, gift. Remember this when you tell your children of their beginnings." With that, he handed Elizabeth a small leather pouch. Inside were several gold coins, enough to sustain her and the twins for months if William rejected them. "Cannot accept," Elizabeth began, but Swift Arrow closed her fingers around the pouch. "Trade goods," he said simply. "Fair exchange for winter companionship." Elizabeth knew it was far more than that, but she accepted with a nod, understanding this was his way of ensuring her children's security without challenging her pride. With final embraces exchanged, Swift Arrow helped transfer the twins to Elizabeth's carrier and gathered what remained of their provisions into a sack she could manage. The Richardson settlement was visible now, a cluster of wooden buildings and fenced fields less than a mile distant. "Remember," Swift Arrow said as Elizabeth prepared to depart, "Creek North, 2 days, until full moon." "I'll remember," she promised, memorizing his features one last time. Then, with the twins secure against her chest and her meager possessions on her back, Elizabeth Morgan walked toward the settlement and whatever future awaited them there. Swift Arrow and Morning Sky watched until she crested the final rise. As she disappeared from view, Morning Sky spoke softly in their native tongue. "Will we see her again, brother?" Swift Arrow's gaze remained fixed on the spot where Elizabeth had vanished. "The path of the white woman and her children is not ours to know," he replied, "but some trails cross more than once when the Great Spirit wills it." With that, he turned his horse northward toward the creek where they would make camp. The winter was ending, bringing new beginnings for all whose lives had intersected in the heart of the storm. Whatever the future held, the bonds forged in ice and survival would endure, a testament to the humanity that could flourish even in the harshest environments. As Elizabeth approached the settlement, she whispered to her children, "Remember who saved us, my darlings. Remember that kindness knows no boundaries, and that sometimes salvation comes from where we least expect it." The twins, too young to understand her words, nonetheless seemed to sense their importance. They remained quiet against her chest as she walked the final distance to Richardson settlement, their journey of survival and unexpected connection giving way to whatever new chapter awaited. Richardson settlement proved smaller than Elizabeth had imagined. Just 8 sturdy cabins, arranged in a rough semicircle around a central well, with a small trading post serving as its hub. A wooden palisade surrounded the entire settlement, its gate manned by a weathered man with a rifle who eyed Elizabeth with suspicion as she approached. "State your business," he called out, not lowering his weapon. "My name is Elizabeth Morgan," she replied, struggling to keep her voice steady after the emotional parting with Swift Arrow and Morning Sky. "I'm looking for William Morgan's ranch. He's my husband's brother." The guard's posture relaxed slightly. "Morgan's place is about 2 miles east of here." He peered at the babies strapped to her chest. "You come all this way alone with them little ones?" Elizabeth hesitated, Swift Arrow's words echoing in her mind. Truth is a weapon sometimes, silence is a shield other times. "My husband Thomas died back east." I was traveling with the Wilson wagon train, but we got separated in the blizzard. It wasn't a lie, merely an omission of what had happened after. The guard whistled low. Thought that the whole train might have been lost in the storm. Jeremiah Wilson showed up here about a month back with only 7 families and said they'd lost some along the way. His eyes narrowed. Said a widow with twins likely perished. Anger flared in Elizabeth's chest. So Jeremiah had arrived safely, but had written her off as dead, not even attempting to send the help he'd promised. She swallowed her bitterness. As you can see, we survived. She adjusted the twins, who were beginning to fuss. Could you direct me to my brother-in-law's ranch? The guard, whose name she learned was Silas Abernathy, offered her water from his canteen and pointed out the trail that would lead to William Morgan's property. It's the place with the red barn. Can't miss it. But he hesitated. You should know William's changed since settling out here. Lost his wife Martha to fever last fall. Keeps to himself mostly now. Elizabeth thanked him for the warning and began the final leg of her journey. The trail to William's ranch wound through rolling hills dotted with scraggly trees, just beginning to show the first buds of spring. The twins, tired from the day's travel, dozed against her chest, their warm weight both comforting and exhausting. By the time the red barn came into view, the sun was sinking toward the horizon. Elizabeth paused, taking in the sight of what she hoped would be their new home. Besides the barn, there was a modest cabin with smoke curling from its chimney and a small corral containing 3 horses. Fields stretched behind the structures, lying fallow for winter, but clearly well-tended during growing seasons. It was a prosperous homestead by frontier standards. Taking a deep breath, Elizabeth approached the cabin door and knocked. Long moments passed with no response. She knocked again, louder this time. Finally the door swung open, revealing a tall man with the same square jaw and grey eyes as Thomas, though his face was leaner, hardened by frontier life, and, she guessed, grief. William Morgan stared at her in confusion, then at the babies. "Who?" "I'm Elizabeth," she said quickly. "Thomas's wife. These are your nephew and niece, James and Sarah." Recognition dawned in his eyes, followed immediately by suspicion. "Thomas wrote me his wife was expecting, but that was nearly a year ago. I never heard more." "Thomas died of typhoid in St. Louis," Elizabeth explained, her voice catching. 8 months ago, before he could send another letter. The twins were born a week after we buried him." William's expression remained guarded. "How did you find your way here?" Again, Elizabeth chose her words carefully. "I joined the Wilson wagon train. We were separated during the blizzard." She met his gaze steadily. "We nearly died out there." Something in her tone must have conveyed the truth of their ordeal, because William's stance softened slightly. He glanced at the darkening sky, then stepped back from the doorway. "You'd better come inside before night falls. Wolves get bold after dark." The cabin's interior was surprisingly comfortable. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, its flames casting a warm glow over simple but solid furniture. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, and Elizabeth noted a loom in one corner with a half-finished blanket still stretched across it. Martha's work, she guessed, abandoned when illness took her. William gestured toward a rocking chair near the fire. "Sit, you look dead on your feet." Elizabeth sank gratefully into the chair. The twins stirred, and Sarah began to whimper with hunger. William watched awkwardly as Elizabeth opened her blouse to nurse. "I'll make some coffee," he muttered, turning to the small kitchen area. As the coffee brewed, an uncomfortable silence stretched between them. William busied himself preparing a simple meal of cornbread and beans, setting a plate before Elizabeth when Sarah had finished nursing and James had taken her place. "Thank you," Elizabeth said, suddenly ravenous. She ate one-handed while continuing to nurse James, a skill she'd perfected over months of traveling. William sat across from her, studying her face. "You favor my mother," he said unexpectedly, something in the eyes. Elizabeth hadn't known that. Thomas rarely spoke of his family, the wound of their estrangement too raw. Thomas didn't share much about his childhood. A shadow crossed William's features. "No, I expect he wouldn't have." He cleared his throat. "What happened to you out there, really? No woman with 2 infants survives a blizzard alone." The directness of the question caught Elizabeth off guard. She considered maintaining her partial truth, but found she couldn't bring herself to deny Swift Arrow's role in their salvation, not even by omission. "We were abandoned by the wagon train when our wheel broke," she admitted, "left with minimal supplies and the promise of help that never came. We would have died in that blizzard if not for—" She hesitated, then continued firmly, "if not for a Comanche hunter who found us and took us to his shelter. He and his sister cared for us until the trails cleared enough to travel." William's expression darkened. "Comanche? You trusted your life and my brother's children to savages." "They're not savages," Elizabeth retorted, her exhaustion giving way to indignation. "They saved us when our own people left us to die. Swift Arrow could have killed us or left us to the elements, and no one would ever have known. Instead, he carried us through a blizzard and shared his food and shelter for weeks." William looked skeptical. "If that's true, why would he help you?" Elizabeth adjusted James, who had finished nursing and now gazed contentedly at the dancing flames in the fireplace. "He said children are sacred gifts, no matter whose blood they carry." That statement seemed to unsettle William. He fell silent, staring into his coffee cup as if seeking answers there. Finally, he sighed heavily. "Thomas and I parted on bad terms. Did he tell you that?" Elizabeth nodded. "He mentioned a disagreement over your inheritance, but not the details." William's laugh held no humor. "Is that what he called it? Our father left the St. Louis business to Thomas and the frontier land claim to me. Thomas thought I'd been cheated, demanded half the business profits in exchange for my labor developing this land." He shook his head. "I refused, told him I wanted a clean break from city life, not a partnership managed from hundreds of miles away." "I didn't know," Elizabeth said softly, understanding better now why Thomas had been reluctant to seek his brother's help when their finances faltered. "After her pregnancy, would it have changed your decision to come here?" William asked bluntly. Elizabeth considered the question. "No," she decided. "The twins deserve to know their family, whatever past quarrels existed between their father and uncle." William nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer. "You can stay," he said, as if coming to a decision, "at least until you decide what you want to do. The bedroom at the back was Martha's sewing room, but there's a bed there." "Thank you," Elizabeth said, relief flooding through her. She had feared being turned away, forced to return to Swift Arrow's camp and impose further on his generosity. "Don't thank me yet," William warned. "Life out here is hard, especially for a woman alone with young ones. The land demands constant work, and danger lurks beyond our boundaries. Indians, wild animals, outlaw gangs, all threats you'll need to learn to handle." "I'm not afraid of hard work," Elizabeth assured him, "and I've learned more about survival in the past month than in all my previous years combined." William's eyes lingered on the twins. "They have Morgan blood. That counts for something." He stood, signaling an end to the conversation. "Get some rest. Morning comes early on a ranch." In the days that followed, Elizabeth settled into life at the Morgan homestead. True to William's warning, the work was constant and demanding. He expected her to pull her weight, and she did so without complaint, grateful for his grudging acceptance. She cooked meals, tended the garden Martha had established, and helped with the spring planting while carrying the twins in their hide carrier Swift Arrow had made. William remained taciturn, but Elizabeth occasionally caught him watching the babies with an expression that hinted at softening. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after her arrival, he returned from the fields to find her singing the same Comanche lullaby Morning Sky had taught her. He froze in the doorway, listening. "What tongue is that?" he asked when she finished. Elizabeth hesitated before answering truthfully. "Comanche. Morning Sky, Swift Arrow's sister, sang it to the twins when they were fussy." She expected anger or disapproval, but William merely nodded. Strange to hear it without gunfire accompanying it. He removed his hat and hung it by the door. "I fought Comanche raiders 3 summers ago when they attacked a neighboring ranch. Lost 2 good horses and nearly my life. Not all Comanche are raiders," Elizabeth said carefully, "just as not all white settlers are kind to those in need." William's mouth twitched. "Fair point." He sat at the table, unlacing his boots. "Your Comanche, Swift Arrow, he teach you anything useful besides lullabies?" The question surprised her. "Many things," she replied. "How to identify animal tracks, which plants are safe to eat, how to find water in seemingly dry places." "Show me tomorrow," William instructed. That knowledge could prove valuable, and so a new pattern emerged. During the day, Elizabeth worked alongside William, sharing the survival skills Swift Arrow had taught her while learning the necessities of ranch life from her brother-in-law. In the evenings, they sat by the fire as the twins slept. Gradually, filling in the gaps of their shared history, Elizabeth learned that William had loved Martha deeply, their childlessness a great sorrow. Martha had been the buffer between William and the outside world, smoothing his rough edges and maintaining connections with the settlement community. Without her, he had withdrawn almost completely. For his part, William seemed increasingly interested in Elizabeth's time with the Comanche. His questions, initially skeptical, became genuinely curious. She told him about Morning Sky's knowledge, of healing plants, Swift Arrow's extraordinary tracking abilities, their deep spiritual connection to the land. "They don't think of owning the earth," she explained one evening. "They believe they belong to it, not the other way around." William considered this difficult philosophy to reconcile with fences and property deeds. "Yes," Elizabeth agreed. "I believe that's at the heart of much of the conflict between our peoples." The night of the full moon arrived, marking the deadline Swift Arrow had set. If Elizabeth didn't return to the creek camp by then, he and Morning Sky would depart for their summer hunting grounds. She stood at the window after William had retired, gazing at the luminous disk hanging low in the sky, and felt a pang of loss. Swift Arrow and Morning Sky had saved not just her life, but her soul, showing her kindness. When she had most needed it, they had become family in the truest sense of the word, and now they would vanish from her life as suddenly as they had entered it. Or so she thought. The following morning, William departed before dawn to mend fences on the far side of his property. Elizabeth was hanging laundry to dry, the twins napping in a basket nearby, when she noticed a figure at the edge of the woods that bordered the eastern pasture. Her heart leaped as she recognized Swift Arrow's distinctive silhouette. Glancing toward the trail to ensure William wasn't returning, Elizabeth hurried toward the tree line. Swift Arrow stepped from the shadows, his expression grave, but his eyes warming at the sight of her. "You did not come," he stated simply. "William, my brother-in-law, took us in," Elizabeth explained, emotions conflicting within her. Joy at seeing Swift Arrow again mingled with anxiety about being discovered. "He's been kinder than I expected." Swift Arrow nodded, accepting her decision. "The children are well." "Yes, growing stronger every day." She hesitated, then added, "I've told William about you, about what you did for us. He was surprised, but not as hostile as I feared." Swift Arrow's eyebrows rose slightly. "This is unexpected. He wants to meet you," Elizabeth said, the words tumbling out before she could reconsider. "He asked me yesterday if there was a way to thank you properly for saving his brother's children." Swift Arrow studied her face, clearly searching for any sign of deception. White settlers and Comanche do not typically exchange pleasantries. No, Elizabeth agreed. But perhaps that's precisely why it matters that we try. After a long moment, Swift Arrow nodded once. Morning Sky has taken our people's summer camp. I will continue to hunt these lands for a while longer. He pointed to a tall oak at the edge of the property. If your brother by marriage truly wishes to meet, build a small fire beneath this tree when the sun touches the horizon. I will come. With that, he melted back into the forest before Elizabeth could respond. She stood still, heart racing at the possibility of building a bridge between these two men who had each in their own way saved her family. That evening, she told William of Swift Arrow's visit and his conditions for a meeting. She expected resistance, perhaps even anger at the Comanche's presence so near his property. Instead, William listened thoughtfully. "You trust this man with your life," he observed, "and the lives of my brother's children." "I do," Elizabeth confirmed without hesitation. William nodded. "Decision made. Then build the fire. I'll meet your Comanche hunter." As the sun began its descent, Elizabeth and William approached the designated oak tree, the twins bundled warmly against the evening chill. William carried his rifle, but, at Elizabeth's insistence, agreed to keep it unloaded as a gesture of good faith. They built a small fire and waited as daylight faded to dusk. Elizabeth began to worry that Swift Arrow had changed his mind or had been merely testing them. Then, as if materializing from the gathering shadows, he stood at the edge of the firelight, tall and imposing in his fringed buckskins. William tensed beside her, but remained seated, one hand resting on his unloaded rifle. Swift Arrow's gaze flicked to the weapon, then back to William's face. "I am Swift Arrow of the Quahadi Comanche," he said in his careful English. "You are the brother of Elizabeth's husband." William nodded. "William Morgan. These lands have been mine for 5 years now." A subtle acknowledgement passed between the men, both territorial, both cautious, both evaluating the other. "Elizabeth tells me you found her and the children in the blizzard," William continued, "that you took them in when they would have died otherwise." Swift Arrow inclined his head slightly. "Great Spirit guided me to them." "Well, I owe you a debt for that," William said gruffly. "My brother and I had our differences, but his children are my blood." Swift Arrow considered this. "Blood ties bind strong, like my sister to me." William seemed surprised by the personal reference. "Your sister, she helped care for them too?" "Morning Sky," Elizabeth interjected. "She taught me many things about raising children in this harsh land." An idea seemed to form in William's mind. "These lands between my property and the creek," he said to Swift Arrow. "You hunt them?" The Comanche nodded. "Good deer trails. Many rabbits." "I've no use for that particular stretch," William said carefully. "Too many trees to clear for farming, and my grazing lands are to the west. If you're hunting there, well, I've no objection as long as you stay clear of my livestock." Elizabeth held her breath, recognizing the significance of William's statement. He was essentially offering Swift Arrow hunting rights on land that by white settlers' law belonged to William, an unprecedented gesture of respect. Swift Arrow's expression revealed nothing, but he straightened slightly. "Fair arrangement. My people do not disturb your animals." William extended his hand, a universal gesture among his people. After a moment's hesitation, Swift Arrow clasped it firmly. "Perhaps," Elizabeth ventured cautiously, "Morning Sky might visit sometimes to see the twins?" The question hung in the air, laden with implications. Such an arrangement would be unheard of a Comanche woman freely visiting a white settlement. Yet neither man immediately rejected the idea. "Summer camp is 2 days' ride," Swift Arrow said eventually. "Morning Sky could come when the moon is half full each month, if you are welcome." William cleared his throat. "The children should know, those who saved them." He glanced at Elizabeth. "And my sister-in-law would benefit from female companionship." With those simple statements, an extraordinary agreement was forged beneath the spreading oak, not a formal treaty between peoples, but a personal understanding between individuals whose lives had become unexpectedly intertwined. As they talked further, working out the practicalities of their arrangement, Elizabeth gazed at her twins, now sleeping peacefully despite the unusual circumstances. They would grow up in a world of boundaries and divisions, but they would also know firsthand that those boundaries could be crossed through courage and compassion. The fire crackled between the unlikely gathering, a frontier rancher, a Comanche, hunter, a widowed mother, and two infants unaware of the historical significance of this meeting. Above them, stars emerged in the vast Texas sky, bearing witness to a fragile new beginning, born from the harshest of winters. It was just one small accord in a land torn by larger conflicts, but for Elizabeth Morgan, it represented everything she had dared to hope for when she had set out with Thomas toward an uncertain future. A place where her children could grow safely, surrounded by people who valued them, in a community founded on mutual respect rather than fear. And it had all begun with a fateful choice made by a Comanche hunter in a blizzard who had seen not enemies in need, but simply humans deserving of mercy. As Swift Arrow had said, children are sacred gifts, no matter whose blood they carry. In honoring that truth, these unlikely allies had found common ground where none had seemed possible before. Spring surrendered to summer across the Texas frontier, bringing both bounty and challenge to the Morgan homestead. The agreement forged between William and Swift Arrow held firm through the changing seasons. True to his word, the Comanche hunter kept his distance from William's livestock, while William respected Swift Arrow's right to hunt the wooded areas bordering the eastern edge of his property. Morning Sky made her first visit when the moon reached half full in May, arriving on a dappled pony with saddlebags filled with medicinal plants and small gifts for the twins. Elizabeth welcomed her with tears of joy, while William maintained a cautious but respectful distance, acknowledging her presence with a nod before retreating to the fields. "Your brother by marriage is not comfortable with me," Morning Sky observed, as she cradled Sarah, who had grown noticeably plumper since their parting. "He's trying," Elizabeth replied, "which is more than most settlers would do." Morning Sky smiled. Small seeds grow into strong trees with time. The visits became a monthly ritual. Morning Sky would arrive at dawn and depart before sunset, spending the intervening hours sharing knowledge with Elizabeth, which wild plants could supplement their garden crops, how to preserve meat for the coming winter, how to use native herbs to treat common ailments. The young Comanche woman took obvious delight in the twins' development, marveling at each new achievement. "James has Thomas's smile," Elizabeth remarked during one such visit as they watched the babies attempt to crawl across a blanket spread on the cabin floor. Morning Sky tilted her head. "You never speak much of your husband." Elizabeth traced a pattern on the rough wooden table. "His memory brings both joy and pain. Sometimes it's easier not to speak of him. In my tribe, we speak often of those who have crossed to the spirit. A world," Morning Sky said gently. "We believe their names on our lips keep part of them in this world with us." The wisdom in those words resonated with Elizabeth. That evening, after Morning Sky had departed and the twins were asleep, she found herself telling William stories about Thomas, his terrible singing voice, his habit of reading aloud from whatever book had captured his interest, his dreams of building a school once they had established their homestead. William listened silently, occasionally nodding in recognition of traits he too remembered from their shared childhood. When she finished, he rose and retrieved a small, wooden box from a shelf. "These were Martha's," he said, opening it to reveal a set of simple but elegant hair combs. She would have wanted them used, not gathering dust as mementos. The gesture, small but significant, marked a turning point. William began to speak more freely of Martha, and Elizabeth shared more memories of Thomas. Gradually, the ghosts that had hovered between them found their proper place, not forgotten, but integrated into the fabric of their present lives rather than standing as barriers to moving forward. The first test of their unusual arrangement with Swift Arrow came in early summer when a band of raiders, white men, not Comanche, struck a homestead 10 miles north of the Morgan Ranch. The Richardson settlement buzzed with rumors and fear, many residents casting suspicious glances toward the wilderness beyond their palisade. Elizabeth was in the trading post, purchasing supplies, when she overheard Silas Abernathy organizing a patrol. "All able men with firearms," he announced to the gathered settlers, "will sweep the eastern woods. If it's Indians raiding again, they'll regret it." Elizabeth's heart sank. Swift Arrow often hunted those woods, and a trigger-happy patrol could easily mistake him for a raider. She hastened back to the ranch, where William was repairing a harness in the barn. "They're forming a patrol," she explained breathlessly. "They'll be searching the eastern woods tomorrow." William's expression darkened. "Fools, more likely to shoot each other than find any raiders." He set aside his work. "Swift Arrow needs to be warned." Elizabeth blinked in surprise. "You would warn him?" "A deal's a deal," William replied simply. "Besides, those raiders were white men by all accounts. Doesn't stop people from looking for Indians to blame." That evening, William himself built the small signal fire beneath the oak tree. Swift Arrow appeared as twilight deepened, listening gravely to William's warning. "White raiders move north," the Comanche observed, "following buffalo herds." William nodded. "Likely so, but the settlement men won't listen to reason when fear takes hold." Swift Arrow considered this. "I have seen these men, 4 of them with many stolen horses. They camp by Broken Rock Canyon." William straightened. "You're certain?" "I do not speak if uncertain," Swift Arrow replied with dignity. A moment of understanding passed between them. William extended his hand, which Swift Arrow clasped firmly. "I'll bring this information to the settlement tomorrow. It might prevent unnecessary bloodshed." The next day, William rode to Richardson and related what he'd learned about the raiders' location, carefully describing it as information from a reliable scout, rather than revealing his Comanche alliance. Silas was skeptical, but ultimately redirected the patrol toward Broken Rock Canyon, where they indeed discovered the raiders' camp. A brief skirmish ensued, ending with 2 raiders dead, 2 captured, and the stolen property recovered. William returned to the ranch a respected figure, having provided intelligence that proved crucial to resolving the threat. If anyone wondered about the identity of his scout, they kept their questions to themselves, grateful for the outcome. When Elizabeth asked if he was troubled by the partial deception, William shrugged. "Truth has many faces. I chose the one that served the greater good." As summer progressed, the twins thrived under the combined care of Elizabeth, William, and their monthly visits from Morning Sky. James, the more adventurous of the two, was soon pulling himself up on furniture and attempting his first wobbly steps. Sarah, though physically less advanced, displayed an uncanny awareness of her surroundings, her eyes tracking movements and her ears attuned to the slightest sounds. "She has the makings of a scout," Swift Arrow commented during a rare daytime visit when William was away at a cattle auction. He had brought a small deerskin dress for Sarah, elaborately beaded with symbols that Elizabeth recognized as protective patterns. "This will keep her safe when she begins to wander," he explained, handling the tiny garment to Elizabeth. For James, he had carved a miniature bow, not a toy, but a true training weapon scaled for small hands. "He is too young yet," Swift Arrow acknowledged, "but when the time comes, it will teach him patience and accuracy." Elizabeth accepted the gifts with deep gratitude, recognizing them as more than mere objects. Swift Arrow was offering the twins something of his heritage, a connection to the knowledge and traditions that had saved their lives. "I will make sure they understand the significance," she promised, "and who they come from." Swift Arrow nodded, his expression softening as he watched the twins play on the cabin floor. "They do not remember the snow that nearly claimed them. This is good. Children should not carry such memories." "But they should know who rescued them," Elizabeth insisted. "When they're old enough to understand, I'll tell them everything." Sudden commotion outside interrupted their conversation. The sound of approaching hoofbeats, followed by William's voice, calling Elizabeth's name with unusual urgency. Swift Arrow moved instinctively toward the rear door, but the front door flew open before he could retreat. William stood frozen in the doorway, taking in the scene. Swift Arrow in his cabin, Elizabeth and the twins sitting comfortably in his presence, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. For a tense moment, Elizabeth feared the fragile trust they had built would shatter. Then William simply nodded to Swift Arrow. "Good you're here. Saved me lighting a signal fire." He turned to Elizabeth. "Comanche riders have been spotted near River Creek. Not Swift Arrow's band, but others. The settlement's in an uproar." Swift Arrow's expression turned grave. "Kiowa Apache Alliance, perhaps. They have been moving into traditional Comanche hunting grounds to the north. Whatever the case, Silas and his men are forming another patrol," William explained. "This time, they won't be as discriminating about which Indians they shoot." Elizabeth clutched Sarah closer. "What should we do?" William and Swift Arrow exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. "Swift Arrow should return to his summer camp," William said firmly. "Move it farther west, away from the patrol." "Roots and morning sky?" Elizabeth asked, unable to hide her concern. "Her next visit is only days away." "Too dangerous now," Swift Arrow declared. "Must wait until tensions ease." Elizabeth felt a profound sadness at the thought of the young woman staying away, but she understood the necessity. The twins had grown attached to Morning Sky's visits, as had she. "How long?" she asked. Swift Arrow looked to William, who sighed heavily. "Hard to say. These things either blow over quickly or escalate into something worse." "I need to warn my people," Swift Arrow said, moving toward the door. "Others may not know the danger." William hesitated, then made a swift decision. "Take my second-best horse. It's faster than traveling on foot, and time matters now." Both Elizabeth and Swift Arrow stared at him in shock. Lending a horse to a Comanche was unprecedented. Horses were valuable property, and many settlers still blamed indigenous peoples for horse thefts. William shrugged uncomfortably under their gaze. "Bring it back when you can, or don't, either. Way, your people's lives are worth more than a horse." Swift Arrow's expression reflected both surprise and a new level of respect. "I will return your horse when safe. This I promise." Within minutes, Swift Arrow had departed, riding westward on William's chestnut gelding. Elizabeth watched from the doorway until he disappeared from sight, wondering when they would see him or morning sky again. "That was a good thing you did," she told William as they returned inside. He busied himself by stoking the fire. Just practical. No sense in him being caught by some trigger-happy patrol when he could outride them. Elizabeth smiled, recognizing his gruff attempt to downplay his generous act. Of course, purely practical. The following weeks brought increased tension to the frontier. The mysterious Comanche band had indeed been Kiowa Apache warriors, as Swift Arrow had surmised, but the distinction meant little to most settlers. Patrols increased, and rumors spread of skirmishes between indigenous hunters and white homesteaders. William made regular trips to the settlement to gather news, returning with increasingly troubling reports. "They're talking about organizing a militia," he informed Elizabeth one evening, "requesting army support from the fort at San Antonio." Elizabeth paused in her task of mending one of William's shirts. "That would mean war," William confirmed grimly, "or something close to it. Certainly no place for peaceful arrangements like ours." The thought of Swift Arrow and Morning Sky caught in such a conflict filled Elizabeth with dread. There must be something we can do. William shook his head. This is bigger than us, Elizabeth. Forces have been building toward this for years. Our little understanding was just a momentary calm in a much larger storm. Despite his pessimistic assessment, William continued to build. The signal fire every evening, though Swift Arrow never appeared. Elizabeth found herself scanning the tree line whenever she worked outside, hoping for a glimpse of either Comanche. The twins, now a year old, continued their rapid development, oblivious to the tension surrounding them. James took his first confident steps across the cabin floor, while Sarah began forming recognizable words. Elizabeth documented these milestones carefully in a journal, determined that Swift Arrow and Morning Sky would know what they had missed. If they returned, summer waned toward autumn, and still there was no word. The chestnut gelding had not returned, nor had any message come from the Comanche camp. Elizabeth tried to suppress her worry, reminding herself that Swift Arrow was a skilled survivor who had navigated far worse dangers than territorial tensions. Then, on a crisp September morning, William returned from an early hunting trip with an unexpected companion. Not Swift Arrow, but Morning Sky, riding double behind him on his stallion. Elizabeth rushed from the cabin, embracing the young woman with tears of relief. "We feared something had happened to you both." Morning Sky returned the embrace, but her expression remained somber. "Many things have happened, none good." She glanced at William. "He found me at the old meeting place by the oak tree. I was leaving this." She held out a small deerskin pouch. Inside was a carved wooden amulet depicting a horse in full gallop, along with several eagle feathers. "Swift Arrow sends this message," Morning Sky explained. "The horse represents your brother by marriage's generosity. The eagle feathers are a promise of protection from above." "Protection?" Elizabeth echoed, confused. "What does he mean?" Morning Sky's eyes filled with tears. "Our band is moving south beyond the Nueces River. The army comes with many guns. The Kiowa Apache raids have given them an excuse to drive all our people from these lands." The news struck Elizabeth like a physical blow. "But that's hundreds of miles from here. We'll never see you again." Morning Sky touched Elizabeth's cheek, gently. "Swift Arrow says to tell you that trails that cross once often cross again. Perhaps when the twins are grown, when memories of these troubles have faded—" "No," William interrupted firmly. Both women turned to him in surprise. "I won't accept that." He paced the yard, clearly wrestling with some internal conflict, before turning back to them. "This land is legally mine by white man's law. 300 acres, with clear title. What I do with it is my business." Elizabeth stared at him, not comprehending his meaning until he continued. "The southwestern corner, where the creek forms, a natural boundary. It's good land, protected by hills on 3 sides. If a family wanted to settle there, build a cabin, well, no one from the settlement ever rides that far onto my property." Morning Sky's eyes widened as she understood his offer. "Would you give land to Comanche?" William shook his head. "Not give. Share, as you've shared your knowledge with Elizabeth, as Swift Arrow shared his skills when we needed warning about those raiders." He straightened his shoulders. "I can't change what's happening across the frontier, but I can decide what happens here on my land." The audacity of his proposal left both women speechless. What William suggested was not merely unusual, but potentially dangerous if discovered. Harboring Comanche on his property when tensions were at their height. Swift Arrow might not accept, Morning Sky said finally. "His pride." "This isn't charity," William insisted. "This is an alliance, 2 families choosing to defy the foolishness around them." He looked directly at Morning Sky. "Tell him I'm offering partnership, not handouts. His hunting skills, your knowledge of plants and medicine, these have value. We can help each other survive whatever's coming." Elizabeth felt a surge of admiration for her brother-in-law, who had traveled so far from the bitter, isolated man who had first opened his door to her and the twins. "Will you take this message to Swift Arrow?" she asked Morning Sky. The young woman nodded solemnly. "I will deliver these exact words, but I cannot promise his answer. Tell him also," Elizabeth added, "that James took his first steps last week, and Sarah has learned to say Sky, her attempt at your name, I believe." Morning Sky's smile broke through her worried expression. "I will tell him this too. Such news lightens even the heaviest heart." William insisted on escorting Morning Sky back to the secluded location where she had left her pony. Before they departed, Elizabeth pressed the journal documenting the twins' milestones into the young woman's hands. "So you'll know everything you've missed," she explained, "and everything yet to come." The wait for a response stretched into weeks. Autumn painted the landscape in golds and reds, and the first hints of winter chill touched the morning air. Elizabeth continued to record the twins' achievements, hoping that someday Swift Arrow and Morning Sky would read of them. Then, on a blustery October evening, as Elizabeth prepared supper and William entertained the twins with wooden spoons as makeshift drums, a knock sounded at the cabin door. William rose to answer it, hand instinctively moving toward his rifle before stopping himself. He opened the door to find Swift Arrow standing tall on the threshold, the chestnut gelding tethered nearby. Behind him, barely visible in the gathering, in darkness, several figures waited with loaded pack horses. "Your offer," Swift Arrow said without preamble. "It still stands?" William nodded, extending his hand. "As long as I hold title to this land." Swift Arrow clasped the offered hand firmly. "Then we accept, not as charity, but as partners." Elizabeth moved to the doorway, the twins balanced on her hips. "Partners," she echoed, her heart full as she recognized Morning Sky among the waiting group, along with an elderly couple she guessed were extended family. Swift Arrow's gaze softened as it fell on the twins. "They have grown strong. Thanks to the foundation you and Morning Sky gave them," Elizabeth replied. "A foundation we can now continue to build upon." As William and Swift Arrow discussed the practicalities of establishing the Comanche family on the southwestern corner of the property, Elizabeth watched the twins watching this scene, too young to understand its significance, but absorbing. Nonetheless, the sight of these two men from different worlds finding common ground. One day, she would tell James and Sarah the full story of their extraordinary beginning, how a blizzard had nearly claimed them, how an unexpected act of mercy had saved them, and how that single act had rippled outward, transforming not just their fate, but the fates of all whose lives had intersected with theirs. For now, it was enough to see Swift Arrow once again cradling James in his strong arms while Sarah reached for Morning Sky with eager hands. The circle that had begun in desperate circumstances was becoming something new, not just survival, but the promise of a shared future where understanding might take root and grow. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the first scattered snowflakes of the season, no longer harbingers of death, but simple reminders of where their journey together had begun. Elizabeth stepped onto the porch, lifting her face to the swirling white specks, and whispered a prayer of gratitude to whatever force had guided Swift Arrow's steps through that long-ago blizzard to find a desperate mother and her freezing twins. Snow that had nearly claimed them had instead given them a new family, one forged across boundaries of culture and history, and in that unlikely union lay seeds of hope for the twins' generation, hope that the divides separating peoples might someday be bridged by simple human compassion, one family at a time. Winter descended upon the frontier once more, though far less severely than the previous year. By mid-November, Swift Arrow and his small family group had constructed a sturdy lodge in the southwestern corner of William's property, nestled against the hills where a natural spring provided water even. In the coldest months, Elizabeth marveled at the efficiency of their building process. The entire dwelling took less than a week to complete, with every member of the group contributing specific skills. The elderly couple, whom Elizabeth learned were Morning Sky's maternal grandparents, Whitefeather and Stonewalker, possessed knowledge that spanned generations. Whitefeather, despite her advanced years, worked tirelessly preparing hides and weaving intricate baskets, while Stonewalker's weather predictions proved uncannily accurate, allowing them to prepare for each storm before it arrived. "My grandfather says cold will come early, but leave early this winter," Morning Sky translated one evening as the two families shared a meal in William's cabin. "Spring planting should begin before the moon of new leaves." William nodded thoughtfully. "That matches what my father taught me about weather patterns. When the squirrels gather extra nuts in early fall, winter hits hard but passes quickly." Stonewalker smiled when this was translated, pleased by the validation of his wisdom. These shared meals had become a weekly tradition, alternating between William's cabin and the Comanche lodge. The arrangement allowed the twins to grow comfortable in both environments, while providing an opportunity for cultural exchange that benefited everyone. For William's part, the decision to shelter Swift Arrow's family had required adjustments. He limited his visits to the Richardson settlement, concerned that loose talk might lead to uncomfortable questions about the southwestern corner of his property. When he did venture into town for supplies or news, he carefully maintained the persona of the solitary rancher, mentioning only Elizabeth and the twins as his family unit. Elizabeth noticed that despite these precautions, William seemed more at ease than she had ever seen him. The bitter grief that had marked his features when she first arrived had softened, and he occasionally even laughed, a deep, rusty sound that suggested long disuse. "You're different," she observed one night, after the twins had been put to bed and the Comanche family had returned to their lodge. "Happier, I think." William stared into the fire. "Martha always said I needed people around me, though I fought against the idea." He poked at a log with the iron poker. "Turns out she was right, as usual. She would approve of what you've done." "Here," Elizabeth offered gently. "Maybe," William conceded, "though I doubt she'd have predicted I'd find community with Comanche." His mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Life takes strange turns." Indeed it did, Elizabeth reflected. Had anyone told her a year ago that she would be living on a Texas ranch with her brother-in-law and a Comanche family, she would have thought them mad. Yet here they were, forging connections that defied the broader conflicts engulfing the frontier. The first real test of their arrangement came in December, when a group of hunters from the Richardson settlement strayed onto the northern edge of William's property. William intercepted them before they could venture further south, greeting them with his rifle casually but visibly resting in the crook of his arm. "You're trespassing, gentlemen," he informed them coolly. Silas Abernathy, leading the group, raised his hands in a placating gesture. "No harm intended, Morgan, tracking a buck that crossed your fence line." "My land, my dear," William replied, evenly. "You should be more careful about respecting property boundaries, especially in these tense times." Silas narrowed his eyes. "Speaking of which, Patterson claims he saw smoke rising from those hills on your southwestern acres. You got squatters?" William's expression remained impassive. "Just clearing some brush for spring planting. Land needs fire sometimes to stay healthy." The explanation seemed to satisfy most of the men, but Silas lingered as the others turned their horses. "Strange you'd be clearing land so far from your main fields," he remarked, "and in winter no less." "Strange you'd be so interested in my land management practices," William countered, "unless you're looking to buy, which I'm not looking to sell." The confrontation ended with Silas departing, but Elizabeth noticed William posting Swift Arrow's teenage nephew, Circling Hawk, as a lookout on the ridge overlooking the approach to the hidden valley. The young man's exceptional eyesight and ability to move silently through the trees made him an ideal sentinel. "Silas has always been too curious for his own good," William muttered as he returned from establishing the watch rotation. "We need to be more careful about the smoke from the lodge. Maybe Stonewalker can advise on how to make it less visible." Despite these precautions, the days fell into a peaceful rhythm. The twins, now toddling confidently, divided their time between both dwellings, absorbing words from both languages and developing a unique blend of cultural awareness. Sarah, in particular, became fascinated by Whitefeather's basket weaving, sitting for hours watching the elderly woman's gnarled fingers create intricate patterns from simple reeds. James, meanwhile, shadowed Swift Arrow whenever possible. By his 15th month, the boy could identify different animal tracks in the snow and mimic the calls of several birds with startling accuracy. William observed these developments with a mixture of pride and bemusement. "That boy's more Comanche than white man some days," he commented to Elizabeth one evening. Thomas would hardly recognize his son. Elizabeth considered this. "I think Thomas would be pleased. He always valued practical knowledge over book learning." She watched James demonstrating a wolf howl he had learned from Swift Arrow. "Besides, there's time for both worlds. The twins won't lack for either heritage." January brought heavy snows that isolated the ranch from the settlement for nearly 3 weeks. Far from creating hardship, the enforced seclusion allowed both families to deepen their connections without fear of discovery. Stonewalker taught William traditional methods for predicting weather changes by observing subtle shifts in animal behavior and cloud formations. Swift Arrow shared hunting techniques that William admitted were superior to those he had used for years. In return, William introduced Swift Arrow to the mechanics of his small forge, where he fabricated simple tools and repaired metal implements. The Comanche hunter proved an apt pupil, quickly grasping the principles of metalworking and suggesting improvements to certain tools based on his own needs. Elizabeth and Morning Sky expanded their shared knowledge of childcare, combining frontier remedies with traditional Comanche medicine to create effective treatments for the twins' occasional illnesses. When James developed a fierce cough during a particularly cold spell, it was Morning Sky's mixture of wild cherry bark and honey that finally soothed his inflamed throat after Elizabeth's mustard plaster had failed to bring relief. 2 medicines, better than 1, Morning Sky observed as James finally slept peacefully. 2 mothers also. The simple statement touched Elizabeth deeply. Morning Sky had indeed become a second mother to the twins, her gentle guidance and unconditional love helping to fill the void left by their father's absence. February brought the first hints of thaw, Chinook winds sweeping down from the north, to temporarily melt the snow before fresh flurries replaced it. During one such warm spell, William announced his intention to ride into the settlement for supplies and news. "We're running low on coffee and salt," he explained, "and I should show my face before people start wondering if we survived the winter." Elizabeth nodded, understanding the necessity but feeling uneasy nonetheless. "Be careful what you say. Silas will be fishing for information." William mounted his horse with a reassuring smile. "I've been dealing with Silas's nosiness for 5 years. Don't worry." But worry she did, especially when William failed to return by nightfall. Swift Arrow noticed her frequent glances toward the trail and offered to scout for signs of William's passage. "No," Elizabeth decided after consideration. "If someone from the settlement saw you on the main trail, it could raise questions we don't want asked. We'll give him until morning." Morning came with no sign of William. By midday, concern had evolved into genuine fear. Had there been an accident? Or worse, had William's secret been discovered? Swift Arrow could wait no longer. "I follow his trail," he announced. "Stay hidden, but find him." Elizabeth struggled with the decision, aware of the risks Swift Arrow would be taking. "If you're seen—" "I am not seen unless I wish to be seen," he replied with quiet confidence. "Small Eagle will come with me." He nodded toward Circling Hawk, whose tracking skills were second only to his uncle's. Two sets of eyes are better than one. Elizabeth couldn't argue with that logic. "Be careful," she urged. "Both of you." The Comanche hunters departed within the hour, following William's trail toward the settlement. Elizabeth busied herself with the twins and household tasks, trying to suppress her growing anxiety. Morning Sky stayed close, offering silent support. Through her presence, night fell with no word from either William or the Comanche scouts. Elizabeth put the twins to bed with stories that failed to mask her distraction, then paced the cabin while Morning Sky brewed calming tea. "My brother is like the shadow of a cloud," Morning Sky assured her. "He moves without being seen. Trust his skills." Just after midnight, when Elizabeth had finally succumbed to exhaustion in the rocking chair by the fire, a soft knock at the door jolted her awake. She opened it to find Swift Arrow supporting a battered and bloodied William between himself and Circling Hawk. "What happened?" she gasped, helping them maneuver William to his bed. William's face was badly bruised, one eye swollen shut, and his breathing labored. "Ambush," he managed through split lips, "just outside settlement." Swift Arrow's expression was grim. 5 men. They waited for him on the return journey, used clubs, not guns, wanted no noise. As Elizabeth cleaned William's wounds, the story emerged in painful fragments. William had completed his business in the settlement without incident, but Silas had been unusually persistent with questions about smoke from the southwestern hills. Several men had watched William depart with more interest than usual. "Should have been more careful," William wheezed as Elizabeth applied witch hazel to his ribs, which she suspected were cracked if not broken. They followed, waited until dark. "Did they say why?" Elizabeth asked, struggling to keep her hands steady as she worked. William attempted a sardonic smile that turned into a grimace. "Said they were teaching a lesson to Indian lovers." Elizabeth's blood ran cold. "They know about Swift Arrow. And the others?" "Suspect," William corrected. "No proof, just rumors. Silas has been watching." Swift Arrow's expression remained impassive, but his eyes blazed with controlled anger. "These men, you know them?" William nodded painfully. "Patterson's boys. And Silas. 2 others you didn't recognize." The implication was clear. The tenuous peace they had constructed was in jeopardy. If Silas and others from the settlement suspected William of harboring Comanche, more violence would surely follow. "We will move on," Swift Arrow stated after a moment's reflection. "Too dangerous for you now?" "No," William grunted, struggling to sit upright despite Elizabeth's protests. "This is exactly what they want, to drive you away, to make us afraid." He coughed, wincing with the movement. "I won't give them that satisfaction." Elizabeth gently pushed him back down. "You're in no condition to make such decisions now. Rest. We'll discuss options in the morning." But by morning, events had already outpaced their deliberations. Circling Hawk, who had taken the pre-dawn watch, burst into the cabin with alarming news. "Riders coming," he reported breathlessly in his limited English. "Many with guns." Swift Arrow was instantly alert. "How many? How far?" 8 men, heavy weapons, at north fence line. William struggled to his feet despite his injuries. "They're coming to search the property," he concluded grimly. Or worse. Elizabeth's mind raced. 8 armed men against their small group. Swift Arrow and Circling Hawk were skilled warriors, but they were outnumbered and would be risking not just their own lives, but those of White Feather, Stonewalker, and Morning Sky if they stood their ground. "You must go," she urged Swift Arrow. "Take your family into the hills until this passes." The Comanche hunter shook his head. "Not without you and the children. They may harm you to punish William." William leaned heavily against the table. "He's right. They know you've been friendly with Morning Sky. They've seen her coming and going. You're not safe here either." Elizabeth glanced at the twins, still sleeping peacefully, unaware of the danger approaching. "Then we all go. Now, before they arrive, I stay," William declared firmly. "Slow them down. Buy you time to reach the hills." He met Swift Arrow's gaze directly. "There's a cave system in the southwestern ridgeline. Used to explore it as a boy, when my father first claimed this land. Most settlers don't know it exists." Swift Arrow nodded in understanding. "The hidden entrance behind the waterfall? I have seen this place. That's the one. Deep enough to shelter everyone, with multiple exits if needed." William gripped Swift Arrow's shoulder. "Take them there, keep them safe." Elizabeth protested, unwilling to leave William to face the armed men alone, but he silenced her with a stern look. "This is my land, Elizabeth, my fight, and I'll handle it better knowing you and the children are safe." There was no time for extended farewells. Within minutes, Swift Arrow had mobilized his family, while Elizabeth gathered essential supplies and bundled the sleepy, confused twins into warm clothing. William pressed his rifle into Swift Arrow's hands. "For protection only," he instructed. "No unnecessary bloodshed." Swift Arrow accepted the weapon with grave acknowledgement of its significance. A white settler willingly arming a Comanche showed a level of trust unprecedented on the frontier. As they prepared to depart through the rear door, Elizabeth embraced William, fiercely mindful of his injuries. "Be careful," she whispered. "We'll wait for your signal that it's safe to return." William managed a pained smile. "I've handled worse than Silas Abernathy," he assured her, though his bruised face belied his confidence. "Now go, before they spot you." With heavy hearts, Elizabeth and the twins joined Swift Arrow's family, slipping away through the pre-dawn shadows toward the southwestern hills. Circling Hawk led the way, his keen eyes picking out the least visible path, while Swift Arrow brought up the rear, alert for any sign of pursuit. They reached the hidden valley as the first rays of sunlight crested the eastern horizon. From their elevated position, Elizabeth could see a group of riders approaching the main cabin. Even at this distance, Silas Abernathy's tall frame was recognizable at the head of the party. "What will they do to him?" she asked anxiously as Swift Arrow urged them to continue toward the cave. "Depends on what they truly want," he replied. "If only to search, perhaps nothing. If they seek an excuse for violence—" He left the sentence unfinished. The cave entrance was exactly as William had described, concealed behind a small waterfall, fed by the spring that emerged from the limestone ridge. The interior proved surprisingly spacious, with a high ceiling and multiple chambers extending deep into the hillside. Stone Walker immediately set about organizing their temporary shelter, directing Circling Hawk to gather dry wood for a small, smokeless fire in a natural chimney that would disperse the smoke through tiny fissures in the rock. White Feather settled the twins with remarkable efficiency, creating a nest of blankets in a protected alcove and distracting them with small toys and quiet songs. Morning Sky helped Elizabeth arrange their supplies, creating an organized camp from which they could sustain themselves for several days if necessary. "My brother will scout," Morning Sky explained as Swift Arrow prepared to depart again. "Watch the cabin. Bring news." Elizabeth nodded, reluctant to see him go but understanding the necessity. The waiting would be the hardest part, not knowing what was happening to William, whether the armed men would be satisfied with a search or if they sought greater vengeance for his perceived betrayal. Hours passed with excruciating slowness. The twins, sensing the tension despite everyone's efforts to maintain normalcy, became fussy and difficult to console. Elizabeth paced the cave entrance, scanning the valley below for any sign of movement, while Morning Sky brewed a tea from herbs she had hastily gathered during their flight. "Patience," the young Comanche woman counseled. "Swift Arrow will return when safe." It was nearly dusk when he finally appeared, emerging from the trees with the silence of a shadow. Elizabeth rushed to meet him, heart hammering with dread at what news he might bring. Swift Arrow's expression was grave, but not despairing. "William lives," he reported immediately, knowing this would be her first concern. Men searched the cabin, then the lodge. Found nothing of value to take, so they burned the lodge. Elizabeth gasped at this senseless destruction. And William? Did they hurt him further? They questioned him, roughly. Swift Arrow's jaw tightened. He denied knowledge of Comanche, said lodge was built by the previous owner, used only for storage. They did not believe, but had no proof to contradict. "Will they return?" Elizabeth asked, glancing involuntarily toward the cave, where the twins were now sleeping under Whitefeather's watchful eye. Swift Arrow considered this. "Not tonight. They posted 2 watchers near the main trail. Rest returned to settlement." His eyes met Elizabeth's steadily. "But they will come again. Their leader, the tall one, Silas," Elizabeth supplied. "Yes, Silas. He's determined to find the truth. Will not stop until I am satisfied." The implications were clear. Their peaceful coexistence had been discovered, and the consequences were only beginning to unfold. Even if they rebuilt the lodge, even if William recovered from his injuries, the threat would remain. Someone would always be watching, waiting for proof of their unorthodox arrangement. "What do we do now?" Elizabeth asked, voicing the question that hung heavy in the air. Swift Arrow gazed out over the valley that had briefly been their shed home. "We have choices, but all carry risk. Stay and fight for this place. Leave together for new territory. Or separate," Elizabeth finished quietly. "Return to our own kinds." The third option, though pragmatic, felt like a betrayal of everything they had built together. Elizabeth thought of the twins, of how they had flourished under the combined care of both families, of the unique perspective they were developing by straddling 2 worlds. "I won't accept defeat so easily," she declared. "There must be another way." Swift Arrow's eyes reflected respect for her determination. "Perhaps. But first, we must ensure William's safety. I will go to him after dark, when the watchers grow tired." "I'm coming with you," Elizabeth insisted. "The twins will be safe with Morning Sky and her grandparents." After brief hesitation, Swift Arrow nodded. "We will go together then. But stay close to me. Night hides many dangers." As twilight deepened into true darkness, Elizabeth and Swift Arrow made their careful way down from the hillside, avoiding the main trails and using the limited moonlight to navigate the difficult terrain. Elizabeth's heart pounded with each snapping twig or rustling leaf, but Swift Arrow moved with such confidence that her fear gradually subsided. They circumvented the watchers Silas had posted, approaching the cabin from the rear. A single candle burned in the window, William's signal that he was alone and conscious. Swift Arrow tapped softly on the back door in a pattern Elizabeth recognized as one they had established for emergencies. William opened the door, his battered face a mask of relief at the sight of them. "Thank God," he murmured, ushering them inside. "I've been worried sick." Elizabeth embraced him carefully, noting with concern that his breathing seemed even more labored than before. "How badly are you hurt?" she demanded. "Tell me the truth." "Bad enough," William admitted, sinking into a chair. Silas was thorough in his questioning. Swift Arrow examined William's torso with gentle but knowledgeable hands. "Ribs broken. Lung perhaps damaged. Needs medicine my grandmother can prepare." William managed a pained chuckle. "Bit difficult to bring me to the cave with Silas's men watching the trails." "Then we bring medicine to you," Elizabeth decided, "and we decide our next steps together as a family." As the 3 sat in the flickering candlelight, discussing options and weighing consequences, one truth became abundantly clear. The simple life they had briefly created, two cultures existing in harmony despite the chaos around them, had been irrevocably altered. Whatever path they chose now would require sacrifice, courage, and an even deeper commitment to the bonds they had forged in the face of adversity. The story that had begun in a deadly blizzard with an unexpected act of mercy had evolved into something far more complex, a challenge to the very foundations of frontier society and a testament to the possibility that compassion could transcend the artificial boundaries humans created between themselves. As dawn approached, Elizabeth stood at the window, watching the first pale light touch the hills where Swift Arrow's family sheltered with her precious twins. The future remained uncertain, fraught with danger and difficult choices, but one certainty remained. The families whose paths had crossed in that fateful snowstorm would face whatever came next together, their lives now intertwined beyond separation. The Frozen Twins' rescue had thawed more than just their small bodies. It had melted boundaries between worlds that most believed could never coexist. And in that thawing lay hope for a different kind of frontier, one built on understanding rather than fear, on cooperation rather than conflict, on the simple, profound truth that humanity transcends all divisions when hearts are open to its possibilities. 3 days after William's confrontation with Silas and his men, Stone Walker appeared at the cabin's back door near midnight, carrying a small pouch of medicinal herbs and powders. The elderly Comanche healer worked silently, preparing poultices for William's bruised ribs and a tea that smelled strongly of pine and willow bark. Despite the language barrier, he communicated through gestures and expressions, his weathered hands gentle but firm as he wrapped William's torso in strips of hide soaked in his herbal mixture. "Tell him my thanks," William managed when Stone Walker had finished his ministrations. His breathing already seemed less labored, though pain still etched deep lines around his eyes. Elizabeth translated, having learned enough Comanche phrases during their months together to convey simple messages. Stone Walker nodded solemnly, then spoke at length, his hands describing shapes in the air that seemed to convey both blessing and warning. "He says your spirit is strong," Morning Sky explained, having slipped into the cabin behind her grandfather. "But danger surrounds this place now. The angry men will return with more numbers when the quarter moon rises." William struggled to sit up straighter. How does he know this? Grandfather walked near the settlement after sunset, heard men talking outside the trading post. Morning Sky's expression was grave. "They speak of gathering men from other settlements. Call it cleansing, of Indian sympathizers." The news settled over them like a physical weight. Elizabeth glanced toward the window, thoughts flying to her twins, still sheltered in the cave with White Feather. "How much time do we have?" 3 days, Morning Sky replied. "Maybe 4. William exchanged a meaningful look with Swift Arrow. "Not enough time for my ribs to heal properly. Not enough time to reach Comanche winter grounds either," Swift Arrow added. "Too far with children and elders." They fell silent, each contemplating the limited options before them. The peaceful coexistence they had built seemed impossibly fragile now, threatened by the violence that characterized so much of frontier life. "There must be a safe place," Elizabeth insisted, refusing to surrender to despair. "Somewhere we could all go, at least until this passes." William stared into the fire, his expression distant. "There might be," he said slowly. "West of here, beyond Devil's Pass. Martha and I sheltered there once during a flash flood. An abandoned mission from the Spanish days, remote enough that most settlers avoid it. Legend says it's haunted by the ghosts of slaughtered converts." "Ghosts don't trouble Comanche," Swift Arrow remarked with a hint of wry humor. "Living men, with guns more concerning." "How far?" Elizabeth asked, calculating what such a journey would require with young twins. injured William and elderly Comanche in tow. 3 days hard riding for a healthy man alone, William admitted. Longer with our group, and the pass itself is treacherous this time of year with melting snow causing rock slides. It wasn't an ideal solution, but faced with armed men coming. To cleanse the area, even a dangerous journey seemed preferable. Swift Arrow nodded decisively. We leave tomorrow at first light. Pack only what can be carried easily. Hide remaining possessions that might be valuable later. The following dawn brought frantic but organized activity. Elizabeth and Morning Sky prepared food for the journey, while William, despite his injuries, created a detailed map showing the route to the abandoned mission. Swift Arrow and Circling Hawk brought horses from William's corral. Not enough for everyone to ride, but sufficient to carry the heaviest supplies and allow the elderly and children to take turns riding when the terrain permitted. We'll follow. The creek westward, William explained as they gathered for a final meal in the cabin. Stay in the tree line where possible to avoid being spotted from a distance. The first day's journey ends at Broken Antler Ridge. There's a sheltered hollow I've used during hunting trips. By mid-morning, they were ready to depart. Elizabeth took one last look at the cabin that had been their sanctuary. It wasn't the grand homestead Thomas had dreamed of building for them, but it had become a true home nonetheless, the first place where her children had known stability and love since their father's death. "We'll return when it's safe," William promised, noting her expression. "This land is still legally mine. No mob can change that." Elizabeth nodded, though uncertainty clouded her heart. The frontier operated on its own rules, and legal ownership meant little when armed men decided otherwise. Still, they had no choice but to move forward with hope. The first day's journey proved more difficult than anticipated. The twins, unaccustomed to long travel since settling at William's ranch, grew restless and fussy despite everyone's efforts to keep them entertained. Whitefeather's knees, stiffened by age and the previous winter's cold, slowed their pace considerably, though she never uttered a word of complaint. William fared better than expected, the medicinal poultice created by Stonewalker providing significant pain relief. Still, by the time they reached Broken Antler Ridge as evening approached, exhaustion had etched deep lines in his face. "I'll take the first watch," Swift Arrow announced as they established their camp in the sheltered hollow. "Circling Hawk will relieve me at midnight." Elizabeth settled the twins on a pallet of blankets, singing softly until they drifted to sleep. Morning Sky joined her, adding harmonies in the Comanche tradition that transformed the simple lullaby into something hauntingly beautiful. "They sleep like bear cubs after long winter," Morning Sky observed fondly when the twins had finally succumbed to slumber. "Strong children. They survive much already." "Thanks to you and your family," Elizabeth replied, watching as Stonewalker carefully rewrapped William's ribs with fresh medicine. Morning Sky shook her head. "Thanks to all of us together. Your strength, William's protection, my brother's guidance. The Great Spirit weaves our paths for purpose." The philosophical observation lingered in Elizabeth's mind as she tried to rest. What purpose could be served by their current flight? What lesson lay in being forced from their homes by hatred and misunderstanding? Perhaps Morning Sky was right. Perhaps their unusual family had significance beyond their own lives, a testament to what was possible when human beings chose connection over division. The second day dawned clear but cold, a brisk wind sweeping. Down from the higher elevations they now approached, Devil's Pass loomed in the distance, a jagged cut between two imposing rock formations that marked the boundary between settled territories and the truly wild frontier beyond. Swift Arrow returned from an early scouting expedition with troubling news. "Riders following our trail," he reported grimly. 8 men, well armed, moving quickly. William's expression darkened. "Silas didn't wait for reinforcements from other settlements. He's coming after us now." "How far behind?" Elizabeth asked. Already gathering the twins' belongings. Half-day's ride, Swift Arrow estimated, but gaining. We must pass before them, harder to track us in rocky terrain. They broke camp with renewed urgency, pushing westward at the fastest pace the most vulnerable members of their group could maintain. Whitefeather and Stonewalker now rode constantly, as did Elizabeth with the twins, while the others walked alongside, leading the horses over increasingly rugged ground. By midday, they reached the eastern entrance to Devil's Pass. The narrow defile stretched before them, its walls rising hundreds of feet on either side. Melting snow created dozens of waterfalls that cascaded down the rock face, some merely silver threads against the dark stone, others substantial enough to cross their path and require careful navigation. This is where we need to be especially. Careful, William warned. Flash floods can form without warning this time of year, and there's only one trail through. We'll be exposed if Silas and his men catch up. Swift Arrow surveyed the terrain with a practiced eye. No choice but to continue, but perhaps we can slow pursuers. He turned to Circling Hawk, issuing rapid instructions in Comanche. The young man nodded eagerly and scrambled up a nearby slope with the agility of a mountain goat. Swift Arrow explained his plan to the others. Rocks balanced at narrow points. When pursuers enter pass, Circling Hawk will release them. Create barrier, force them to dismount and clear path. Buy us time. William nodded approval. Good thinking. But the boy will need to move quickly afterward to rejoin us. He knows these lands, Swift Arrow assured him. We'll find an alternate path over the ridge and meet us at the mission. With the trap set, they continued through the pass, each step taking them further from the life they had built and toward an uncertain future. The twins, sensing the tension in the adults, remained unusually quiet, their wide eyes taking in the towering walls and cascading water with solemn wonder. The most treacherous section came near the center of the pass, where the trail narrowed to barely the width of a horse and skirted the edge of a steep drop-off. The ground here was slick with moisture, and loose stones made each step precarious. One at a time here, William instructed. Lead the horses carefully. Elizabeth crossed, first with the twins secured tightly against her, then helped Whitefeather negotiate the dangerous stretch. Stonewalker followed, then Morning Sky. William went next, moving slowly due to his injuries, but maintaining steady progress. Swift Arrow brought up the rear, leading two horses laden with their most essential supplies. He had nearly reached the wider section where the others waited when a sharp crack echoed through the pass, the unmistakable sound of a rifle shot. A bullet struck the rock wall inches from Swift Arrow's head, sending stone fragments flying. The horses reared in panic, one breaking free of his grip and bolting forward, nearly trampling Morning Sky before William caught its reins. "Ambush!" Swift Arrow shouted, diving for cover behind a boulder as a second shot rang out. Elizabeth clutched, the twins tightly, pulling them behind the partial shelter of an outcropping. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she tried to locate the source of the gunfire. There, William pointed upward, toward a ledge some 50 feet above the trail. Sniper position. Must have circled ahead of the main group. Swift Arrow notched an arrow to his bow, a weapon he carried more from cultural habit than practical necessity, as he had never needed to use it during their peaceful months together. Now he sighted carefully along the shaft, tracking the barely visible movement above them. He released the arrow with fluid precision. A cry of pain echoed through the pass, followed by the clatter of a falling rifle that narrowly missed Whitefeather before clattering down the ravine. "Go!" Swift Arrow urged the others. "Move quickly while he is disabled." They scrambled forward, abandoning any pretense of caution in favor of speed. Behind them, angry shouts suggested more pursuers were entering the pass from the eastern end. A distant rumble reached their ears. Circling Hawk, implementing their plan to block the narrow trail with falling rocks. The western exit of the pass came into view as they rounded a final bend. a widening of the walls that opened onto a sparse, high-elevation forest. They had nearly reached it when William stumbled, his weakened condition finally overtaking his determination. He fell heavily to one knee, grimacing in pain. "Leave me," he gasped as Swift Arrow moved to help him. "Get Elizabeth and the children to safety. I'll delay them here." "No man left behind," Swift Arrow replied firmly, hoisting William to his feet with surprising strength. "Comanche way. Morgan way too, I think." Elizabeth couldn't hear William's response over the growing commotion behind them, but she saw determination replace resignation in his expression as he leaned on Swift Arrow and continued forward with renewed purpose. They burst from the confines of the pass into the relative openness of the forest beyond. The abandoned mission lay another half-day's journey ahead, but first they needed to put distance between themselves and their pursuers. "There's a box canyon about 2 miles north," William directed, pointing toward a stand of pine trees. "Accessible only by one narrow trail. Defensible position if it comes to that." Swift Arrow nodded agreement, and they altered course accordingly. The terrain here was challenging, but less immediately dangerous than the pass. The horses navigated the slopes with careful steps, while the humans picked their way through undergrowth that showed no signs of recent passage. By late afternoon, they reached the box canyon William had described. Its high walls offered protection from the elements and observation, while the single entrance could be guarded by just 1 or 2 people if necessary. A small spring bubbled from the rock face at the far end, providing fresh water. "We'll rest here tonight," William decided. "See if Circling Hawk rejoins us. Assess whether we've lost our pursuers or merely gained temporary respite." The canyon provided natural shelter, but the evening air at this elevation carried a biting chill. They built a small, nearly smokeless fire, using techniques Stonewalker demonstrated, positioning it beneath an overhang that would disperse what little smoke rose from the carefully selected wood. The twins, exhausted by the day's events, fell asleep almost immediately after eating. Elizabeth arranged them in a nest of blankets near Whitefeather, who hummed a gentle melody while working on a small weaving project she had somehow managed to bring along. William sat beside Swift Arrow at the canyon entrance, keeping watch. As twilight deepened into night, despite their precarious situation, a curious calm had settled over the group. The peace that comes from knowing one has chosen the right path, however difficult. "I never thought I'd find myself on the run with a Comanche family," William remarked softly, adjusting the sling that supported his injured arm. "If you'd suggested it a year ago, I'd have called you mad." Swift Arrow's expression remained impassive, but a hint of humor touched his eyes. "1 year ago, I planned revenge against white settlers for losses suffered. Now I protect white man who calls me brother in spirit. Life follows strange trails." William nodded thoughtfully. "Do you ever wonder if there's purpose in it? Some design beyond our understanding. My people believe all paths are drawn by the Great Spirit," Swift Arrow replied. "Not always straight paths. Sometimes circle back, sometimes climb mountains, sometimes descend to valleys, but all with purpose." He glanced toward where Elizabeth sat with morning sky, preparing medicinal tea for Stonewalker's arthritis. Perhaps the purpose was for children to know both worlds, carry wisdom of each into the future when we are gone. The observation struck William with unexpected force. The twins, born of white settlers but saved by Comanche compassion, represented something unique, a bridge between worlds that most considered irreconcilably separate. In them, perhaps, lay the seeds of understanding that might someday transform the frontier from a place of conflict into one of cooperation. "If we survive this," William said after a lengthy silence, "I intend to make formal what we've created informally, file legal papers establishing joint ownership of my land with you. Ensure that if anything happens to me, Elizabeth and the twins will have your protection, and your family will have legal claim to remain." Swift Arrow stared at him in surprise. Such paper exists. White man's law allows this. There are ways, William assured him. Unorthodox, perhaps, but possible for those determined enough. My father was a lawyer before he caught frontier fever. He taught me how to navigate legal boundaries creatively. Before Swift Arrow could respond, a soft bird call echoed from the forest below. 3 notes, then 2, then 3 again. His face brightened with recognition. "Circling hawk," he explained, returning the call pattern. Minutes later, the young man appeared at the canyon entrance, tired but triumphant. "Rockfall worked," he reported excitedly. "Men trapped in pass. Must dismount, move rocks by hand. Take many hours." He grinned, displaying chipped front teeth that somehow enhanced rather than diminished his youthful vitality. "Some men argue with the leader, say this pursuit foolish, want to return to settlement." This welcome news lifted everyone's spirits. If division had emerged among their pursuers, they might abandon the chase entirely, rather than risk the increasingly difficult terrain and approaching darkness. By morning, their hopes were confirmed. Swift Arrow and Circling Hawk scouted the surrounding area at first light, returning with reports that no pursuit was visible from any direction. Whether permanently abandoned or temporarily delayed, the immediate threat had passed. "We should still reach the mission," William advised. "Establish ourselves there before deciding next steps. It's defensible if they renew their pursuit, and hidden enough to give us time to consider options." The final leg of their journey passed without incident. By mid-afternoon, they crested a ridge to see the abandoned mission nestled in a valley. Below, a small stone church with a fallen bell tower, surrounded by the remains of outbuildings that had once housed converts and missionaries. San Esteban de la Misericordia, William identified it. St. Stephen of Mercy, established in the 1780s, abandoned during unrest in the early 1800s. Local tribes considered it cursed after disease swept through the converts. Settlers avoided it from superstition. As they approached, the mission's weathered walls revealed surprisingly sturdy construction. The roof had partially collapsed in one section, but the majority remained intact. Inside, the stone floor was dusty, but sound, and the altar still stood at the far end, its once ornate carvings worn by time and elements. "This will serve," Swift Arrow decided after a thorough inspection. Many rooms, strong walls, hidden location. They set about making the abandoned mission habitable, clearing debris and establishing living spaces within the most intact sections. By nightfall, a transformation had begun, the cold stone edifice softening with the addition of blankets, small cooking fires, and the sounds of children's laughter echoing from walls that had known only silence for decades. As Elizabeth tucked the twins into makeshift beds that evening, James looked up at her with his father's serious grey eyes. "Home?" he asked, one of the few clear words in his developing vocabulary. The simple question gave Elizabeth pause. What constituted home? Now, the cabin they had fled, this ancient mission with its stone saints watching from crumbling niches? Or perhaps something less tangible, the circle of protection formed by these unlikely companions who had risked everything to remain together? "Yes, little one," she answered finally. "Home is where we all are, together." From across the room, she caught Swift Arrow's gaze. The stoic Comanche hunter who had once found her and her freezing twins in a blizzard now offered a rare, full smile that transformed his weathered features. Beside him, William nodded in quiet affirmation, while Morning Sky continued the lullaby she had been singing, her voice filling the mission's cavernous space with hope. Outside, stars emerged above the valley, the same stars that had witnessed a desperate mother's prayers in a frozen wagon, a hunter's compassionate choice, a brother-in-law's grudging acceptance, and the gradual formation of a family that defied every convention of the frontier. Whatever challenges awaited them, And surely there would be many. They would face them as they had faced all previous trials, together, drawing strength from their differences rather than being divided by them. The legacy of that fateful blizzard was still unfolding, writing itself into the lives of two tiny children who would grow up knowing that boundaries between peoples existed primarily in the minds of those who feared to cross them. In their world, such boundaries had been rendered meaningless by the simple, profound truth that compassion could overcome even the deepest divisions when hearts remained open to possibility. As night settled fully over their sanctuary, the last embers of their cooking fires mirrored the stars above, small points of warmth and light in a vast darkness, insignificant perhaps in the grand scheme of things, yet essential to those who gathered around them. Just as their unusual family might seem a tiny anomaly in the violent history of the frontier, yet contained within it the seeds of a different future, one where understanding might eventually replace fear, and cooperation might someday overcome conflict. That future lay beyond the horizon, but its foundation had been laid in a moment of mercy during a snowstorm, when a Comanche hunter had found a settler woman and her twins freezing in the snow, and had chosen to see not enemies, but simply humans in need of compassion. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload. From us,